Can we stand for the Gospel reading? So today is the feast of the Immaculate Conception, and so the reading is from Luke as well, chapter 1. In the 6th month, the angel Gabriel was sent from God to a town of Galilee called Nazareth, to a virgin betrothed to a man named Joseph of the house of David, and the virgin's name was Mary. And coming to her, he said, "Hail, favored one, the Lord is with you." But she was greatly troubled at what was said and pondered what sort of greeting this might be. Then the angel said to her, "Do not be afraid, Mary, for you have found favor with God. Behold, you will conceive in your womb and bear a son, and you shall name him Jesus. He will be great and will be called Son of the Most High. And the Lord God will give him the throne of David his father. And he will rule over the house of Jacob forever, and of his kingdom there will be no end." But Mary said to the angel, "How can this be, since I have no relations with a man?" And the angel said to her in reply, "The Holy Spirit will come upon you, and the power of the Most High will overshadow you. Therefore, the child to be born will be called Holy, the Son of God. And behold, Elizabeth, your relative, has also conceived in her old age, and this is the 6th month for her, who was called barren, for nothing will be impossible for God." Then Mary said, "Behold, I am the handmaid of the Lord. May it be done to me according to your word." Then the angel departed from her. These are words inspired by God. During the time that I lived in Kenya, I lived with 3 different tribes of Kalenjin people. There are 7 different Kalenjin tribes, but I lived basically with just 3 of them. For a short period, I lived with a tribe called the Nandi, and then for almost 7 years, a tribe called the Kipsigis, and for the last 7 years I was in Kenya, I lived with a tribe called the Tugen. And the Kalenjin, and particularly the Nandi and the Kipsigis, were the great runners of Kenya. They were the people who won so many Olympic medals in long distance running. People like Ben Jipcho and Kip Keino, whom you probably know of. And they were great runners because they were herdsmen by profession. And they lived at an elevation of about 9,000 feet. So when these guys came for international competitions and they were running at sea level, there was so much oxygen in the air, they couldn't believe their luck. They could run and run and run and run and never run out of breath. So they really dominated sports in the 60s and 70s and 80s. And if you still look at the big marathons throughout the world, it's nearly always either Kenyan or Ethiopian runners that win these marathons. So the fact that they lived at 9,000 feet and then came down to run at sea level gave them a huge advantage. Now I want you to imagine for a few moments, imagine somehow that an extraterrestrial were to arrive on planet Earth and to disguise himself as a human. And it's unknown that he's of ET origin. But this guy is not subject to gravity. He has anti-gravitational abilities, and he doesn't need to breathe even though he has a nose to fool us. He doesn't need oxygen, so he's not going to run out of breath. And somehow, the person who's in charge of picking the American Olympic team every year discovers this guy running one time. He doesn't know who he is, and he persuades him to become part of the US team. And they see how good he is. They enter him for the 100-yard, dash. They enter him for the 220, the 440, the 880, the mile, the 3,000-meter steeplechase, the 5,000-meter, the 10,000-meter, the marathon, the high jump, the long jump, and the pole vault. And he wins Olympic gold medals in every single one of them. And then the trainer said to all the other guys, "Why can't you be like him? Why can't you run as fast as he can or jump as high as he can jump?" Not knowing that he's an extraterrestrial who's not subject to gravity or doesn't have to breathe. Now, I sometimes feel that that's kind of the load that we put on to Mary, the mother of Jesus, particularly for this feast day of the Immaculate Conception. If we claim that Mary was immaculately conceived, so she didn't have the stain of original sin or any of the handicaps that gives us, how could she possibly be an exemplar for us? If she's so radically different that she had none of the handicaps that the rest of us have, how in God's name could we ever imitate her? We could appeal to her for protection. We could ask her to intercede for us. But how could we actually imitate her? And so that's what I want to talk about today. What does the Immaculate Conception really mean? And to get into it, I'm going to just make 4 main points. Firstly, I want to talk about what the doctrine actually says. And then secondly, I want to talk about the notion of sin. If we don't understand sin, we don't understand what Immaculate Conception meant. And then thirdly, I want to talk particularly about the idea of original sin. Where did that come from and what does it mean? And then fourthly, I'm going to ask myself the question, how or why did Mary escape original sin? So there are the 4 points I'll go through this morning rather quickly. So firstly, the doctrine itself, the doctrine of Mary's Immaculate Conception. And many people misunderstand what this actually means. What it does not mean is the virgin birth. The Immaculate Conception does not mean that Mary conceived Jesus immaculately, without the use of a human agent, without the use of a male agent. So some people think that's what the Immaculate Conception meant. It meant that Mary conceived Jesus in her womb, without the use of a human father. And that is not what the Immaculate Conception means whatsoever. What the Immaculate Conception means is that Mary herself, when she was conceived in her mother's womb, her mother was called Anna, so long before Jesus existed. Jesus did not exist until Mary was about 15 or maybe 20 years of age. He did not exist. The second person of the Trinity existed, but Jesus did not exist because Jesus was an incarnation of the second person of the Blessed Trinity, we claim. So he didn't exist. Jesus did not exist. So Mary is conceived in her mother's womb, and in that conception, she avoids original sin. Now, in 1854, Pope Pius IX declared this doctrine, the doctrine of the Immaculate Conception of Mary. Now, it was an old belief system going way back, but is formally decreed in 1854. And according to the decree, Mary was conceived herself without original sin due to the merits of her son Jesus. So it's a retroactive, blessing. Jesus did not exist when Mary was conceived. But Mary is conceived immaculately, according to this decree, because of the merits of her son Jesus, who won't be born or even conceived for at least another 15 or 20 years himself. And so the Immaculate Conception is a very interesting kind of a teaching. Lots of ideas around there. So that's what it actually says, that Mary was conceived due to the merits of her son, not her own merits, but the merits of her son Jesus, who wasn't even around for another 15, 20 years. That's what the doctrine says. So if Immaculate Conception means then that she was born without the stain of original sin, I now want to get into my second point to talk about what actually does sin mean and what's the history of sin and what's culpability. And as I've thought about this throughout the years, I'm convinced that, sin has gone through various stages. What we think of as sin has gone through various stages. So initially, I'm convinced that sin was the breaking of a taboo. And so I believe that at the beginning of the human race, when Homo sapiens sapiens came around, we accidentally discovered how to get into altered states of consciousness. It may have been through plant medicine. Maybe the tree in the Garden of Eden was ayahuasca, or maybe it was a magic mushroom, or maybe it was peyote, or one of these things, and that they ingested it, and suddenly they had interdimensional experiences that they couldn't handle. But in traditional societies, particularly shamanistic societies, it is verboten for somebody to wander into a mystical experience unless they're trained for it. And so what happens is, if you have a mystical experience and you've no theology in which to ground it, one or two things is going to happen. The first one is you're going to go mad because you're flipping your lid. You have no idea what's happening. You're traveling interdimensionally. You're having visions or hallucinations or whatever you want to call it, and you're just going to freak out and go mad. Or the second thing is you're going to get inflated and think, oh, what a great guy am I. Look what I'm seeing. And so it was verboten to wander into a mystical experience without being initiated and prepared. And that was the job of the tribe or the cultures or the elders to prepare the young people and initiate them into the possibility of having mystical states. So I just wonder sometimes if actually the sin of Adam wasn't that the fruit of the tree wasn't some kind of, hallucinogen, or more importantly, an entheogen, something that gives you an experience of God, and that they couldn't handle it because nobody had trained them how to do it. God had just said to them, stay away from that tree. Don't eat that plant. Don't go near ayahuasca. Don't eat magic mushrooms or whatever it was. But there was nobody to train them, how to handle the experience they had. So the first stage of sin, I'm convinced, was the breach of a taboo. And you find that in traditional society still. That's what sin means. The second notion of sin, it morphs then, I believe, into the notion of the breaking of a covenant. That a group of people, a culture, a tribe, make a covenant with a particular kind of God. And it's called a corporate singularity. They act as a single entity. The entire tribe is a single entity. So if one person breaks the covenant, the entire tribe is guilty, because it's regarded as a corporate singularity. There's only one entity, and the entity is the tribe. And if anybody breaks it, the whole tribe is guilty. And we see this happening, for instance, at the very, very beginning. Because of the sins of our early parents, God decided to flood the world and destroy everybody and everything. Only 8 human beings are saved. Everything else is wiped out. So this would be an example of corporate singularity. We still do it today. In the 70s and 80s, we had a medical embargo, on Iraq, which led to the death of 750,000 little children who didn't have access to medical treatment. So to get rid of a dictator, we killed 750,000 little children. When we went in there with Desert Storm some years later, we killed 150,000 troops and a whole bunch of other people to get this guy out of office. So the notion of a corporate singularity is still very prevalent. We did the same thing in Libya with Gaddafi. We went in to get rid of Gaddafi, and we created mayhem and refugees and murdered thousands of people again. So this notion of a corporate singularity is still alive, and thriving on planet Earth today. So that, I believe, would be the second notion of sin. Somehow the breach of a covenant that a tribe makes with their God. The third notion of sin, I think, had to do with infraction of individual precepts. So beginning about the year 2100 BCE, there's the first codification of human law. It's called the Code of Ur-Nammu, and it comes from Mesopotamia. And there was trying to regulate both personal and social relationships. Then came the very famous one called the Code of Hammurabi. It was decreed about the year 1776 BCE. And then you have the story of Moses about 1250 BC creating his own code. And among the Celts, we had our own code. It was called the Brehon Laws, which was a codification of human behavior individually, and collectively. So when you breach any one of these particular laws, that I believe was the third notion of sin. But I believe that all of these really are just parenthetical or higher order, ideas of sin. My belief system is that the basic form of sin is to be asleep, to refuse to participate in the project of enlightenment, of continuing to grow. So we refuse to learn from our own personal karma or from our cultural karma. We're not learning from the lessons we should be. We continue to make the same kinds of mistakes again and again. So we're not even open to feedback from the results of our own behavior or the results of our cultures or our nations or our species' behavior. We identify with the ego rather than with the soul. So there's a mistaken identity. So that for me is the basic sin. The basic sin is that we think we are the spacesuits in which we walk around. We think we are our bodies, or we think we are our emotions, or we think we are our intellect, we think we are our personality, and we're not any of these things. We're bite-sized pieces of God who volunteered for incarnation. So we're asleep at the wheel, and that for me is the basic sin. And from that same basic sin, everything else kinds of emerges. So then you look at how then are we responsible or culpable? And again, as I work myself through the Judeo-Christian scriptures, I've seen that process evolve in 7 different stages. Initially, the first kind of notion of culpability was that nobody would take responsibility. Adam and Eve ate the forbidden fruit, whatever it was, and when God asked them, why did you do that? Adam blames his wife, and his wife blames the serpent, and the serpent blames God for creating him. Nobody will take responsibility. So the first stage of culpability is nobody is culpable. Nobody will take responsibility. The second stage is then God blames everybody. If nobody will take responsibility, no one individual will take responsibility, God is going to blame everybody. So he wipes them all out in a flood. And thereafter, all of humanity are thrown out of the Garden of Eden. Just the second stage of culpability. Everybody is responsible. The third stage you find during the story of the Exodus, where once a year the high priest, called Aaron, who was Moses' brother, would all the people would come to him and they'd confess their individual sins to Aaron. And then Aaron would take a goat from the flock and he'd impose hands on the goat and he'd confess all of the sins of all the people on the goat and send the goat off out into the desert to be killed by a mountain lion or something. Now that's the origin of the phrase, the scapegoat. So that goat took on the sins of everybody else. And Christianity reintroduced that model. Jesus became the scapegoat that took all our sins, and was crucified for our sins. This is the kind of thinking that goes into it. So that was stage 3, the scapegoat. Stage 4 happened when God began to realize that he was losing in popularity. His numbers were going down. So now he changed his mind and he said, from now on, I'll only hold people guilty to the 3rd and 4th generation. So you commit a sin, I'll blame you, I'll blame your children, your grandchildren, and your great-grandchildren, but after that, I'll forgive. So this is the next stage. God is kind of relenting, of his viciousness, stage 4. Stage 5 happens about 600 years before Christ, when 2 great prophets in Israel, a guy called Jeremiah, who lived about 600 years before Jesus, and a prophet called Ezekiel, who lived about 550 years before Jesus. And they both quoted a Hebrew proverb that said, in effect, the proverb said, the parents have eaten sour grapes, and the children's teeth are set on edge. So the sensation in your mouth, if you eat something really sour, your teeth, kind of tingle. And the proverb was that even though it was the parents who ate the sour grapes, it's the children's teeth that are set on edge. And both of these prophets said, from now on, this will not be the case. From now on, only the person who eats the sour grapes will have their teeth tingling. So this seems like that's as good as it gets, that you're not going to progress any further. That is, personal responsibility for sin. Jesus came and he introduced 2 more stages to it. Stage number 6 then becomes, Jesus realized that very, very often it is unjust laws that's making sinners of people. If you keep multiplying ridiculous laws, there's no way people are going to be able to avoid breaking these laws. In the United States of America at the moment, there's over 1 million laws on the statute books. It's almost impossible to live in America and not break laws on a regular basis. Laws that we don't even know about. So Jesus says, in that case, it's the lawmakers, the people who introduce these kind of ridiculous legislation that are responsible for the sins of the sinners. And then the final stage was, even if that's the case, life is meant to be lived to heal all of the sin of the world. Jesus spent his entire life healing and living in such a way that he was trying to undo the sin and the culpability, however you define it. And this is what it means to be a follower of Jesus Christ. It is to try to live our lives in a way in which we are offering healing to the world, not apportioning blame to people, not getting upset with people, not renouncing our own kind of responsibility, but living a kind of a life which is actually healing for interpersonal relationships and for our country and for our species itself. So that would be my understanding then of the notion of sin and culpability. And I need to put that in place in order to discuss what original sin might be. So when we talk then about original sin, what exactly does that mean? So this has been debated for many, many years. At the very beginning, the early church fathers debated this. What did original sin really mean? So one theory was that original sin goes right back to Adam and Eve. That whatever act of disobedience they were responsible for, that somehow it got genetically encoded, almost like in a Lamarckian fashion, that it got genetically coded into all their progeny. So that every human being born subsequently, has this inclination toward evil in some way, or this inclination toward disobedience in some way. So it's like a virus that infected, the genetic code. So everybody born subsequently is affected by whatever act of disobedience that Adam and Eve were guilty of. In the year 412 CE, Common Era, or AD, Augustine formulated his own version of it. So Augustine was a North African Roman citizen, who lived a very, very promiscuous lifestyle. In fact, he had a child out of wedlock. And then he got converted to Christianity, and like many converts, he became ultra, ultra, ultra orthodox. So Augustine lived at a period of time when the Roman Empire was crumbling. The barbarians from the north were invading Rome. And so the bureaucratic, regularized, rational Roman system was crumbling under the irrational behavior of these Saracens and barbarians of various kinds. So Augustine came to the conclusion that we are most godlike when we are most rational and in control of ourselves, unlike these barbarians. So the Roman Empire represented for Augustine formality and being really centered. He came to the conclusion that when a man and a woman are making love, at the moment of orgasm, when they're totally irrational, they're most ungodlike because they're most out of control, and it's at that moment that the child gets conceived. And so Augustine was convinced that kids are brought into being at the very moment when their parents are most ungodlike. And he called that, and that's what original sin is like. It's this concupiscence in us that causes us to be totally out of control, irrational, and most ungodlike. And so he defined that this was what original sin was. And he said there were 3 effects to original sin. And every little child then is conceived with that and born with that stain. And the 3 results are that our will is weakened, our intellect is darkened, and our bodies are subjected to sickness and eventually to death. And so every one of us then is born and we're not able to think correctly. We don't have a strong will. We're going to get sick and we're going to die. Now, the Roman Catholic Church went on to claim that baptism, the sacrament of baptism in some senses, undoes original sin. But if that's true, is pouring water over a child's head and saying, I baptize you in the name of the Father and of the Son and the Holy Spirit, is that going to affect his will? Is it going to be no longer dark? Is his intellect going to be better? Is his body not going to get sick and die? Obviously, baptism does not undo original sin. If original sin means your intellect is darkened, your will is weakened, and your body is subject to sickness and death. Every single one of us, no matter how many times you get baptized, are going to get sick and die. And our will is weak and our intellect is darkened. So it doesn't make much sense to me that baptism somehow undoes original sin in the way in which Augustine was talking about it. So I've got a very, very different notion of original sin. I don't believe that sickness and death are punishments for original sin. They're just part of the contract of incarnation. And so I think original sin is the following, that original sin has 3 kinds of aspects. The first one, that it is due to the fact that we reincarnate many, 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 many times. And we bring all of our history of previous incarnations with us. We bring our habits with us, our desires with us, our faults with us, and our strengths with us. And we carry that into each lifetime. So a little baby does not arrive tabula rasa, like an empty slate. It arrives with a long, long, long history of previous lifetimes. And so in some senses, that's handicapping us until we become totally enlightened. So every one of us is born as the result of previous lifetimes that we've lived and the karma that we've collected, both good karma and bad karma. That's the first aspect of original sin for me. And the second aspect is that we're born then into physical spacesuits that are very, very limited. We've got this tiny little laptop that we carry between our ears that we call the brain to try to grok the entirety of life. We're subject to the notion of chronology or time. We're stuck into these tiny little bodies, we who are cosmic beings, and we have amnesia for who we really are. We don't realize that we're bite-sized pieces of God. So the second part, or the second factor that creates original sin is the fact that we're born into bodies which are very, very limited. And these are bodies that are going to get sick and going to die. And the third factor, I think, of original sin is that we're born into a world in which cultures have evolved who are based on anger and fear and anxiety and warfare. So we're surrounded constantly, from the child we're little children, with defective human beings. Our own parents even are defective. And certainly our cultures and our species is defective. So we're trying to make way in a world which is dedicated to fear and anxiety. So that's the original sin that a little baby comes into. Part of it is his own trajectory. Part of it is the physical spacesuit. And that's not just the genetics, that particular families have particular weaknesses genetically encoded, but the very fact that the spacesuit itself is very, very limited. So these are all part of, I think, what original sin is about. Now, I don't think that that's a bad thing. I think that that's part of the contract of incarnation. It is only by limiting ourselves that we can really, really grow. This is the equivalent of, working out in the gym, trying to bench press 360 pounds in order to build up your body. Or it's the equivalent of getting out in the morning when there's snow on the ground and running 6 or 7 miles to train for a marathon. So it is by limiting our comfort levels that we actually evolve spiritually. So when I think of original sin then, and I think of these 3 factors that go into it, I do not see it as punishment. I see it as just our movement, from grade school to high school to college or maybe postgraduate stuff. That it is part of the task of incarnation. So for me, original sin is not this terrible verdict that God passed on us because of our sinfulness. It is part of our agreement and our covenant to try to grow, to try to be able to become loving beings, whatever situation we find ourselves in, whether it's a crippled body, whether it's a body that's reaching the end of its lifetime, whether it's in a dysfunctional family, whether it's a period of human history which is really, really turbulent. We volunteer to be here in order to grow individually and to try to change and move our species along. Which brings me to my last point then. How is it, or why was it, that Mary escaped original sin? Now, as I say, the Catholic Church teaches that she was retroactively saved, that Jesus, who didn't exist yet, somehow retroactively was able to protect his mother from the vicissitudes of original sin. Now, personally, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. So when I think about Mary, what I think about is this. She was not saved from original sin in the sense that, that she entered a world which wasn't turbulent. She lived in very, very turbulent times. We think we live in difficult times. She lived in much more difficult times. So from the time she was born, she was confronted with the same kind of world, or maybe a more difficult kind of world than you and I are. So she's subject to that level of original sin, what the world presents to her. She, was born to parents, I'm sure, who were not perfect. She was born in a culture which was not perfect. She was born in a world which was far from perfect. And I cannot believe that she was not subject to the vicissitude of her own individual spacesuit. I'm sure Mary got the flu. I'm sure she coughed occasionally, or sneezed, or got headaches, just like the rest of us. And I'm sure she died, even though the Catholic Church teaches there's a doctrine called dormitio, where when she died, she was taken immediately bodily up to heaven. But I'm sure Mary lived, was sick, and died like the rest of us. The big difference between Mary and the rest of us, where she did avoid original sin, in my sense, is this, is that Mary was a very, very, very old soul. An old soul who'd worked through all her own personal karmic stuff, so that when she arrived, she could hit the ground running. That even though she's born into a body which is just like yours or like mine, subject to sickness and death, and although she was born into a world which was much more turbulent than the one in which we now are, she came in as an ancient, ancient soul. And she came in with a preconception contract to be the mother or the channel for another extraordinary avatar who would be known as her son, Jesus. And they came in this contract to try to shift the dynamic, of the human species. And 2,000 years later, we're still celebrating their greatness, even if we fail to imitate it very, very often. And so Mary avoided original sin only in the sense that her own personal stuff did not contribute in any way to the vicissitude of incarnation. She came in as a healing presence, linked arm in arm, holding at our breasts a little child with whom she had contracted to come in to try to change the human equation. So when I think of this doctrine of the Immaculate Conception today, I'm not thinking about any kind of special kind of decree or special kind of blessing that Mary got that made her different from the rest of us. She's not an ET who didn't experience gravity, or having to breathe in order to win Olympic gold medals. She came in with the same kind of body into a much more difficult planet or time in the planet, but she came in as this extraordinarily old soul who managed not only to survive in this, with this kind of body, in that kind of cultural environment, but to bring healing to it and compassion to it and loving to it. And so when I think and when I celebrate today the doctrine of the Immaculate Conception, I'm thinking of the greatness of the soul whom we now venerate, and rightly so, as Mary, the Mother of Jesus.